She was known as the mother of the nation, beautiful, brave, but also brutal. Winnie Mandela was at her husband's side when he walked to freedom after 27 years in a prison cell on Robben Island. 4 years later, apartheid was consigned to the history books and South Africa had its first black president. She was known across the world because of who she had married, but she was an anti-apartheid campaigner in her own right. And in reality, the couple spent less than a year together before he was jailed.
They did not even have a year together. He was on the run. They didn't even get a chance to cut the wedding cake because he had to disappear soon after.
Winnie was in her early 20s when she married Nelson Mandela. He was nearly twice her age and already had 3 children. He said he was struck by her beauty. This was apparently his favourite photo of her.
My husband has been fighting for the liberation of the African people, for the working harmoniously of all the racial groups in this country.
When Nelson Mandela was jailed, she took on the cause. She gained widespread support amongst South Africa's poor and dispossessed. It was an appeal that couldn't be ignored even by those leaders that followed Nelson Mandela. And she herself was keen to remind people of just how important her role had been.
You wouldn't have the liberation South Africa has today if I hadn't done that. I would do that 100 times more. There is no greater reward than the one we both had of a liberated South Africa.
She continually defied the apartheid state.
Don't drag me! I'm coming! Don't drag me!
Here she punched a policewoman who was trying to stop her returning to her home in Soweto.
Don't push me!
We have stones, we have boxes of matches.
But she became linked with far more brutal violence closer to home, including so-called necklacing, killing suspected traitors with burning tyres.
With our necklaces, we shall liberate this country.
Justice Winnie-style was meted out by vigilantes in her so-called Mandela United Football Club. They terrorised Soweto. She was convicted of ordering the kidnapping of 4 teenagers. The body of one 14-year-old Stompie Maketsi was found in Soweto. She was sentenced to 6 years but escaped jail. It was only years later at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that she admitted she'd made mistakes.
It is true. Things went horribly wrong. For that, I am deeply sorry.
The couple separated in 1992 and later divorced. Mourners gathered outside Winnie Mandela's house in Soweto today. Up until the end, she polarised opinion. For her supporters, she remains the mother of the nation. For her critics, she's tarnished by violence and corruption. Her first name was Nomzamo, which means she who must endure trials. Her life certainly lived up to her name.
Well, I'm joined now by the writer John Carlin, whose book about Nelson Mandela became the basis for the film Invictus, and the South African political analyst Moeletsi Mbeki, whose brother Thabo Mbeki was the country's former president. Mr. Mbeki, it seems clear there were 2 different versions of Winnie Mandela, weren't there?
Well, I don't think there were 2 versions. There were 2 periods in the history of South Africa. One, which was the struggle against apartheid, and the other, which was the last 24 years, which was the rule of South Africa by the ANC. So we have that situation where Winnie Mandela played a central role in the struggle against apartheid, and then she committed a number of errors, obviously, during that period. And then we have the other Winnie Mandela, who had a personal life with Nelson Mandela, her divorce, the fight between the 2 of them.
I mean, John Carlin, how do you assess those 2 versions, those 2 periods of Winnie Mandela's life? Because there was no doubt she played a huge part in the struggle, paid many sacrifices.
I know a lot about the Winnie Mandela's crimes and those of the people around her. I was in South Africa as correspondent at the time. I wrote a lot about it. I talked to families of the victims of the people that she associated with. But I'm reluctant today of all days to focus on that, because what stays with me, despite the fact that she directly or indirectly did awful things, including killing people, she was a magnificent personality. Maybe not a magnificent person, but she was an epic, sort of heroic sort of person. And she was a more than, well, not more than, she was a very apt match for Nelson Mandela. The two of them were these enormously charismatic figures. I think sort of almost Shakespearean, or sort of, Greek tragedy, kind of Antony and Cleopatra. And she was a formidable and most impressive person.
I mean, she was only ever convicted of the kidnap and denied any involvement in murders. But how crucial was that charismatic, huge character to keeping the struggle going while Nelson Mandela was in jail?
Well, it was very important. Mandela was sentenced to prison with my father. And at the time, the ANC was in the doldrums. The apartheid regime had put all its energy to destroying the infrastructure of the ANC, to destroying its leadership. So Winnie standing up to the apartheid regime after that very dark moment for us was very, very, very important in encouraging the younger generation to continue the fight. So she was very central in the revival and the maintenance of the spirit of the fight against apartheid.
Yeah, and she brought that, like I described, that sort of titanic, epic, heroic personality. And I know I'm using big adjectives, but they're actually appropriate to Winnie.
And many people will dislike the heroic adjective applied to Winnie Mandela.
Well, perhaps, but that is one truth about Winnie, is that. I mean, I got to know her fairly well. I actually had some run-ins with her, but that's another story. But I mean, I saw her, for example, at demonstrations, riots in which, large numbers of black demonstrators during apartheid, before Mandela was released, were confronting white riot cops with guns, with live bullets, with tear gas, with dogs. And the manner in which people would be screaming, shouting, running, panicking, and Winnie would just go up to the colonel in charge, the white guy, and she was a black woman, in a way, under the law, a minion there, and yet she just stood before him, and she clearly was intimidating this person and was a bigger personality than that white cop.
But what happened to her in the later part of her life that, in a sense, made her abuse that power that she had, or certainly not always use it for good?
Well, as John said, there were two Cleopatras in Africa, one in North Africa and the other in South Africa. And Winnie Mandela was the Cleopatra in South Africa. She was a larger-than-life figure, even larger than Nelson Mandela, if that was possible. She was a very frightening person. I mean, I remember during the morning of the death of Oliver Tambo, the former ANC president, we all gathered at his house to come and meet, console the family. And there were lots of ANC leaders walking in, coming to see Mrs. Tambo and her children. Nobody stood up for them. But when she walked in, everybody stood up. That was the larger-than-life personality she was.
Which of those versions of events, if you like, or which of those parts of her personality will win out in terms of her legacy, do you think?
Well, like I say, I think today is a day to do what Moletsi and I are doing, which is to highlight her greatness, her presence. She was this queen, African queen, was she not? But I think that, with time, when people obviously allow this period of sadness and mourning to pass, there will be inevitably, we'll end up with a fairly balanced view. There was good and evil. There was a good angel and a bad angel in Winnie Mandela.